Hello and welcome to the Curator on Monocle Radio with me, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Over the next 60 minutes, I'll be bringing some of the very best interviews and reports from Monocle Radio this week. This time we uncover the latest from the political situation in New Caledonia.
It sounds like a diplomatic dispute conjured by a wheel of fortune. France is accusing Azerbaijan of fomenting unrest in New Caledonia.
Plus, we speak with the legendary Swedish group Ace of Base.
It's easier now when you have a few years afterwards, when you have a little more perspective on the career than when we were actually inside this crazy circus, because it was just totally crazy, mayhem all the time.
All that and much more in the next hour here on The Curator with me, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. We start the show indeed in New Caledonia, which have seen better days. Andrew Muller explains France's role in the South Pacific territory and why Paris is blaming a fresh round of unrest on Azerbaijan.
It sounds like a diplomatic dispute conjured by a wheel of fortune. France is accusing Azerbaijan of fomenting unrest in New Caledonia. This unlikely spat is, however, very much happening. France's Interior Minister, Gérald Darmanin, perhaps seeking to forestall the obvious follow-up, gravely asserted that this isn't a fantasy, it is a reality. By way of retort, Azerbaijan Foreign Ministry spokesman Ayhan Hajizadeh harumphed, "We refute any connection between the leaders of the struggle for freedom in Caledonia and Azerbaijan." Which, to be fair to France, does sound like the sort of thing you might say if there is, in fact, a connection between the leaders of the struggle for freedom in Caledonia and Azerbaijan. We will return presently to the diverting question of why Azerbaijan on the southwestern Caspian Sea would be stoking a rebellion in New Caledonia in the southwestern Pacific Ocean, given that there is, and we checked, fully 13,793 kilometres between their respective capitals, Baku and Noumea. Seriously, flying between them would take like 40 hours. You'd have to change into Tbilisi, Dubai and Sydney. But we should look first at why New Caledonia is of such interest to France, whose capital is even further from Noumea than Baku, also about 40 hours change in Helsinki and Singapore. The reason is that New Caledonia is part of France, after a fashion. France helped itself to the archipelago in the 1850s, and for the next several decades dumped convicts there, as the UK had been doing in Australia. The relationship between New Caledonia and France since has not always been easy, but in 3 referendums within the last 6 years, a condition of a late 90s accord which gradually transferred more powers to local government, New Caledonians have rejected the opportunity of becoming a sovereign nation and chosen to maintain the connection with France. There is arguably an asterisk next to the last of these votes, as pro-independence types boycotted, claiming that it shouldn't have been held amid a nasty COVID-19 outbreak. Nevertheless, New Caledonians remain French citizens, returning representatives to Paris and even, rather quaintly, voting in EU elections. President Emmanuel Macron visited New Caledonia as recently as last year. As this explainer goes to air, he has made an impromptu return. Still no small undertaking, even if you do have your own plane. For things in New Caledonia have recently gone seriously askew. In recent days, New Caledonia has been racked by dreadful violence. At least 6 people have been killed, including 2 gendarmes, hundreds injured, dozens of buildings and vehicles destroyed. A state of emergency has been declared, including a nighttime curfew and bans on the sale of alcohol. The video platform TikTok has been unplugged. As more French troops and police are dispatched, the air forces of Australia and New Zealand are scrambling to evacuate their citizens.
Overnight, thankful Australians have been returned home from New Caledonia, escaping the violence and the deadly riots.
At issue is a reform to voting in New Caledonia's provincial elections. The franchise is to be extended to any French citizen who has lived in New Caledonia for 10 years. This has gone over badly with some of New Caledonia's indigenous people, or Kanaks, who comprise roughly 40% of New Caledonia's 270,000 people. The Kanaks, who tend towards favouring independence from France, fear that extending the vote to European incomers will dilute their influence, and suspect that this is indeed the idea. At which point the reasonable listener is likely still wondering what in the wide world of sports any of this has to do with Azerbaijan, whose interests in the Pacific could be supposed to be unextensive. However, it is not completely impossible that Azerbaijan is taking the opportunity to cause France trouble a long way away for reasons closer to home. France has in general been a good friend to Azerbaijan's neighbour and rival Armenia. Last year, France was notably critical of Azerbaijan's ethnic cleansing of the Armenian enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh. Azerbaijan, said President Macron, seems to have a problem with international law. By way of rebuke, Azerbaijan's President Ilham Aliyev has teed off repeatedly at France, accusing Paris of outrageous neo-colonialism, which is, to be clear, the worst kind of neo-colonialism, among other malfeasances. Last year, Azerbaijan invited separatists from several French territories to a conference in Baku and formed something called the Baku Initiative Group, whose mission statement declares support for, as it puts it, French liberation and anti-colonialist movements. Judging by footage of the disturbances in New Caledonia, delegates were also given Azerbaijani flags to wave once back home, building barricades and setting fire to things. France also complains of a social media disinformation campaign targeting New Caledonia and operated from Azerbaijan, and honestly it would be more surprising if there wasn't one, as such enterprises cost beans to run and are as effective as the human capacity for believing what it wants to be true is eternal. It is also doubtless the case that nationalist grievance is no harder to stir up in New Caledonia than it is anywhere else. Tell people they should be better off, and the fact that they aren't is all someone else's fault, and they'll burn down their own country in agreement. For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Mullett.
Kenyan President William Ruto was welcomed in Washington, D.C. by First Lady Jill Biden at the start of the first state visit to the U.S. Capitol by an African head of state since 2008. The visit comes at a delicate moment for the United States in Africa, where China is expanding its influence and where only last week Niger's military government ordered an end to security cooperation with Washington. As Simon Marks reports here, President Ruto is challenging the Biden administration to prove that it is serious about deepening its engagement with the continent.
The city of Atlanta didn't just roll out the red carpet for Kenyan President William Ruto and his wife Rachel, the country's First Lady, when they flew in on Monday. It rolled out a local African-American marching band as well. Even before his official state visit to Washington begins later today, the Kenyan president has made good use of his time in the United States, making it clear that he has not just travelled here to request a deepening of American partnership with Kenya, but to persuade the Biden administration to get its head back in the game more generally across Africa.
This visit is a historic milestone as the first state visit by a Kenyan head of state in 2 decades.
President Ruto's spokesman, Hussein Mohammed.
The visit demonstrates the robust partnership between Kenya and the United States and is a fitting tribute to 60 years of diplomatic ties that we are celebrating as Kenya and the United States.
Beyond the historical symmetry of that timeline, there is much more at stake over the next 3 days. And speaking after a visit to the Carter Center, the non-governmental organization founded by former US President Jimmy Carter, which has made extensive contributions across Africa, President Ruto laid out his agenda.
The war in Ukraine, the conflict in the Middle East, the fighting in Sudan, South Sudan, Eastern DRC, the Sahel, and terrorism in Somalia all demand global leadership.
He says he wants the United States not just to claim it's committed to partnering with African nations to support them and protect their democracies, but actively to prove it.
We now run the escalating risk of democracy and free markets being associated with poverty and suffering. I believe the United States of America has a historic opportunity to lead the free world in dealing with this economic situation and give meaning to democracy and free market economy worldwide, including in Kenya and many other developing countries.
He says he envisages the US doing more to support concessionary development financing for every developing country, shoring up African democracies where they are under threat, but also mitigating the impacts of climate change. The concerns that Kenya's leader is voicing here are not unique to Kenya. Earlier this year, unremarked upon in the United States but much noticed in Africa, President Biden made not a single reference to the continent in his State of the Union address on Capitol Hill. And President Ruto arrives in Washington emblematic of the balance that many African leaders are now striking. His country is part of China's Belt and Road Development Initiative, even as he also talks about the opportunity for fresh outreach by the United States.
Kenya makes a lot of sense for this type of a visit.
Analyst Bob McMahon is with America's Council on Foreign Relations.
This is one of the closest allies U.S. has actually in Africa at a time when there have been some backsliding and real defeats, I would say, for U.S. on the African continent in terms of its projection of power and influence.
Those recent defeats include enormous tensions with South Africa after President Cyril Ramaphosa's government made its move at the International Criminal Court to accuse Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of genocide in Gaza. Just days ago, the military leaders who seized power in Niger last year insisted security cooperation with the United States that has allowed the Pentagon to use the country as a monitoring post for jihadist activity throughout the region must come to an end. American troops will make an ignominious withdrawal against Washington's wishes no later than September, and the Council on Foreign Relations' Bob McMahon argues that presents an opportunity to work with Kenya.
The U.S. would like to maintain a base in Kenya and eyes on the ground in that part of the world where al-Shabaab remains active. And so I think at the end of the day, it would serve them better, these countries better, to be in a closer partnership with the U.S. But the U.S. just has to show more. And again, this first state visit in 15 years, there's a demonstration effect and not just sort of this bit of a crude security transaction that we have sometimes seen in the past.
On at least one security transaction, President Ruto is looking for backing from his American hosts. In days, more than 2,500 Kenyan police are due to arrive in Haiti to fulfill a mission on behalf of the United Nations at a time when drugs gangs have overwhelmed the Haitian government and its security forces. President Ruto wants to know that if his police face the prospect of being overrun themselves, then the Americans will, in some fashion, have their backs. In Washington, he'll lay a wreath at Arlington National Cemetery, be welcomed to the White House by President Biden, and will hold meetings with members of Congress. But notably, he will not address a joint session of Congress. The Republican Speaker of the House of Representatives, Mike Johnson, cited a scheduling conflict for his failure to issue that invitation. Some in Kenya argue it's a US election year snub, reflective of the Republican Party's general antipathy towards the continent. The visit may end up being remembered for one extraordinary image. At the Carter Center, President Ruto came face-to-face with basketball legend Shaquille O'Neal. Well, not exactly face to face. O'Neill, who measures 7'1", just over 2 metres tall, towered over the visiting couple. It's an extraordinary picture, and also a reminder that the US more generally may want to tower over Africa, but African leaders facing other choices are now more than ready to stand up to Washington. For Monocle Radio, I'm Simon Marks in Washington.
You are listening to The Curator on Monocle Radio with me, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. This time we'll hear from contemporary art legends Gilbert and George at their new exhibition in East London.
Well, for years, as we walked the streets of the world, we were stopped by young people who say, "I love your art." And we always said, "Which art did you see?" They'd never actually seen an exhibition. They'd seen a magazine or a television program. And we realized that access to the art of living artists is very rare. You have to wait years for an exhibition of Henry Moore, maybe 10 years. And so we thought, let's have somewhere in central London where it's always available.
What was a motto was art for all, so you want the public to be in front of our pictures. So it's very limited, except maybe even you have a big show like the Tate Gallery, it's for 3 months, that's it, forever. So we want to, in some way, to be able to show our pictures, because it is, our motto has been art for everybody, so that's why we build it.
And for our international listeners who are just walking down Brick Lane in East London, how accessible is it? Can you just walk straight in?
Yes, it's open to the public, it's free of charge,
yes.
and it's off one of the most famous high streets in the world, Brick Lane. Wherever you go in the world, everyone knows Brick Lane. It's extraordinary. Even if you stand outside Aldgate East Station, everybody coming out of the station is looking for Brick Lane. I think it's a centre for romance or something. I'm not quite sure, but something to do with romance.
They seem to know it all over, even Japan, in America, they all used to tell us all about it.
Everyone heading from Brick Lane is aged between 28 and 32. Why is that?
Well, I'm 33, and I still walk down Brick Lane. And actually, thinking of romance, you have a very romantic gate on the way in. I believe it's silent green. Can you explain your beautiful wrought iron gate?
We decided we should do a gate to our new centre, and we decided to honour our new king, Charles. It was going to be for Elizabeth, but she passed away, so we left the 2 for Elizabeth and added 1, and changed the E to C and left the R. And it's painted in visible green, because when the Industrial Revolution hit the world, people started walking to places where they could get wages, and they walked from villages just as the bee flies, and they were walking over Toff's land, and people were looking out the window thinking, what are all these common people doing? Let's sit up fences. And they didn't know what colour to paint the fences. And they asked Capability Brown, the great landscape artist, what colour should the fences be? And he invented the colour invisible green based on the different greens you could see in the landscape, from holly to grass to trees. So it's all a crazy invention.
And these beautiful gates have been open for 1 year now.
1 year, yes.
How has the centre been received by the public?
I think extraordinary public we have, extraordinary. Everybody seems to love it, the whole idea. It's not a monumental, it's small, but it is 3 big galleries, and we can see a certain amount of pictures, and it's free. It's all free. Beautiful catalogues we produce, and I think they love it.
And there are people from different parts of the world in London all the time, yeah? So a lot of the people who came to see the show are from Latin America or from the Far East, a lot of Europeans.
And they seem to know Brick Lane as well, so not only our centre, but Brick Lane is quite important for them.
So 1 year on, we're actually sitting surrounded by an absolutely overwhelmingly wonderful exhibition that has returned after 10 years, or it's coming here for the first time in 10 years. Can you explain the London pictures that are currently sitting in the gallery?
London pictures. It all started when we were walking to London and passing all the newsagent shops and finding we could steal the posters from outside, until we ended up with 3,700.
Yes, every night when we go for dinner, we used to do a big walk, a half-an-hour walk, and we were able to collect all these posters. I think it took 2 or 3 years to collect all these amazing stories. They tell an amazing story. It's like a cityscape in some way.
Did you receive a warm reception when they travelled the world? What did international viewers of it? How did they interpret it?
We do get a lot of love. We get a lot of love letters from countries we've never visited.
And prisoners.
And a lot from prisoners, strangely, yes. I think prisoners can identify with our message of freedom.
And this is now 10 years. Is this a London that's recognisable now?
Nothing has changed, not really. The same subjects.
There will always be pupils.
Divorce, yes.
And there's a huge number of pieces here. How was it transporting it around the world?
This is a small group of the London pictures, which number in their
nearly
entirety.
300. And here we have 26 now, but altogether there are nearly 300.
One day we will find a very strange big space where we can show all 262 pieces. That will be extraordinary.
We showed them, I think, 11 years ago all over, from Japan to Germany to Italy, America, and all this stuff. But now these are our pictures, so we wanted to show in our place. It's very good because normally it's only 3 months if you show in a museum, but here 1 year is quite exciting.
And all work features the late Queen in the form of how she appears on various coins.
Like a stamp, stamping it here.
At different ages as well.
And what was the thought behind her inclusion?
I think it's a huge thank you from us. She was the most loved person in the world. Huh? Extraordinary.
And have you had an opportunity to mark the accession of Charles III?
Oh, we did.
Yes, we've just created a group of inkwashes. God Save the King, Long Live the King, Chaz Forever. We're very excited about it. And they're available online, and strangely, they're sold to countries that don't have a monarchy, that would rather like to have a monarchy, I think.
Like in Naples.
In Naples, they buy them, but they did have a monarchy and no longer have one.
It's quite amazing.
Naples are buying Long Live the King. Extraordinary.
So that's part of something that you have done recently. Are you working on anything currently?
We just started 7 new pictures, which are top secret, but I can give you the titles. We did 7 pictures. Bolted.
Whisked.
Screw You.
Just Eat.
Mangal 1.
4 Straws.
Cross-screwed. There's a lot of screwing now.
A real exclusive there. I'd say George has just pulled out a huge wad of paper from his pocket to bring us that. How are you collecting inspiration currently?
We're
thinking and feeling.
Feeling the world, that's
moment.
very simple.
That's the job of the artist. Right?
Yes, we are not completely brain dead, but yes.
So you're not always skulking around in the dead of night stealing inspiration?
That's an entirely different subject.
To Ukraine now, a convoy of 20 vehicles due to be scrapped in London's low-emission zone scheme arrived in Ukraine last weekend. More than 100 such vehicles have been donated to Ukraine, where they're vitally needed through a London scheme that launched earlier this year. But behind-the-scenes campaigners say change is needed if the scheme is to pave the way for other European cities that are due to expand their low-emission zones. Monocle's Julia Lassica met with one of the volunteers, Richard Lofthouse, to find out more.
Richard Lofthouse and I are standing on the edge of a field looking at some cars.
Yes, we've got one Mitsubishi L200 and a couple of Nissan Navaras. Those are pickup trucks. One has a canopy top, one is just a pickup truck. There's a few vans, and then the rest is made up from cars and smaller vans. There's about 23 vehicles immediately in front of us, and then a couple of others a bit further down the way in a separate property.
An academic and journalist, Richard has travelled across London and taken the train deep into the Surrey countryside to show me these cars. Because on the side, he is also a charity volunteer and campaigner. And the cars he's showing me are not actually meant to be here at all. They're meant to be hundreds of miles away, in Ukraine. In the summer of 2023, London's Mayor Sadiq Khan expanded the city's low-emission zone, known as ULEZ. Under the new rules, tens of thousands of older cars became non-compliant. Their owners were encouraged to scrap them and receive a one-off payment in exchange. When Richard and other volunteers working to transport cars to Ukraine heard of the scheme, they knew it presented a unique opportunity.
I thought penny drop at that moment. I was driving over to Ukraine at the very start of last year, 2023, and thought it's crazy that one of the world's great cities is going to pay a large public subsidy to scrap thousands, tens of thousands of vehicles many of which would be of huge short-term use in Ukraine. Ukraine is desperately short of wheels. The number one vehicle that Ukraine wants are the heavy-duty pickup trucks because they're very, very versatile and they're good value as well in Britain. There are lots of them. They can double as armoured personnel carrier if they get armoured by volunteers in Ukraine, which happens quite a lot. They're good for getting people in and out of different situations, and they can be used as medical evacuation as well because of the long beds.
But whilst Richard's campaign was approved in principle after months of delays by London Mayor Sadiq Khan, only a few dozen cars have been acquired through the scheme.
Transport for London was in charge of implementing the scheme, and they decided to contract with a trusted partner, and they wanted a regulated body, so they naturally went with a charity, and they went with British Ukrainian Aid, and British Ukrainian Aid are de facto in charge of running the scheme. And of course, I think all of us can understand the simplicity of that. And we in fact had a wonderful meeting at the Ukrainian Embassy in London in Holland Park on March the 11th, a few days before the scheme went live, where we all got together to discuss how we could all help to maximise the benefit of the scheme for Ukraine. As it's turned out, it's not really worked out like that. British Ukrainian Aid have decided to do it very much along their own lines and in their own way, and have involved volunteers and some other groups, but on a very small scale compared to what we had envisaged.
The story illustrates the problem that plagues too much of the help pledged to Ukraine. Nifty solutions get tangled up in red tape.
Good thing about big foundations is that they have a lot of opportunities. They can buy really expensive stuff in the quickest time. But at the same time, they have a lot of bureaucracy. They need to know that this help will go to needed people. They need appropriate documents from army guys, and sometimes it's really impossible to get all those documents.
Victor is a project manager at a software company who has been working in his spare time on supplying cars to his country's front line. He is just one of hundreds of thousands of individuals inside Ukraine and out, making up for the gaps left by big initiatives. Jonathan Varney is another such volunteer. He explains the high stakes that accompany delays.
I've been responsible for taking many cars to Ukraine since the beginning of the war, since March 22. I've taken over 130 cars down. They've all been destroyed now. The attrition rate is huge. I was in Ukraine during the withdrawal from Avdiivka, and there was a video doing the rounds whilst I was there of a young girl pleading with her brother, who was a soldier in Avdiivka, pleading with her brother to leave before the Russians got there, and him trying to explain to her that he couldn't leave because he was badly wounded and they didn't have enough transport to take him out. Well, they stayed. The Russians moved in, and shortly afterwards his executed body was seen on another video taken by a Russian soldier. It was heartbreaking.
Volunteers who are keen to work with London's Mayor Sadiq Khan are clear. Transport for London needs to tap into the volunteer spirit that arose in response to Russia's aggression, and they need to appoint a second charity to the scheme. They also demand greater transparency from British Ukrainian Aid. Then, London will have created a blueprint that other cities like Edinburgh or Paris, who are also bringing in a clean air zone, can follow. Back in the Surrey countryside, Richard is determined to solve the hold-up.
There are several thousand vehicles that have already gone to Ukraine very, very efficiently at the hands of individuals and small groups, several of whom were part of a consortium that we set up at Christmas to, envisaging that the little boats approach, to use the Dunkirk analogy, is the right one here, where a lot of people can achieve a great deal by being left to get on with it and do it the way they know best.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
Join the Monocle class of 2024. This spring, Monocle is extending a special subscription offer to graduates embarking on new adventures who want to see the world through an optimistic lens. Visit monocle.com/subscribe and enter the promo code GRAD2024 to receive 20% off a print or print and digital subscription. Enhance a degree and inspire curious minds.
We're back here with the Curator. Time now to sit down with Franco-Palestinian chef Fadi Katan to hear about his new book, Bethlehem, and learn about the bonds that food can build within a community.
My food journey began like everybody else at the age of 6 months. My mother made a terrible mistake, was feeding me some cereal and then gave me a taste of a meat pie that's Palestinian called sfiha. Tried to give me some more of the bizarre wheat thing, which I spat away. And since then, I've been totally somebody fixated on food. I did start learning to cook, like a lot of people, in my grandmother's kitchen. It's not, I think every chef in the world will tell you this. It's really the first taste buds that develop. And then you're watching, I mean, if you're like a 2-3-year-old kid, you're watching in awe this like production happening in a kitchen. For me, it started there. I was lucky to have my mother's mother be this fantastic cook that she was. My mother's an exceptional cook. I actually still call her and ask her things like, oh, so how do we do that recipe? Now she laughs and she's like, oh, are you going to deconstruct it? Why are you asking me? I'm not going to give you those foundations, but she does. I started professionally. I studied hospitality in Paris with a strong focus on food. And I went back to Palestine in 2000 for the opening of a hotel I was working for. The second Intifada happened. We closed down the hotel and I stayed. And I actually joined my father's business, which is selling commercial kitchens. So I was on the other end of the spectrum. And I used that to organize the first Palestinian cooking competition. And I was shocked because most of the chefs competing were actually creating European-influenced recipes, because at a certain moment worldwide, there was this obsession of a duck à l'orange is more glamorous than your own cuisine. And that led me into starting to explore, how do I take our kitchen that is very traditional, that's very family-oriented, that's very much one large sharing dish, and how do I take that into the setting of a restaurant? I opened Fauda in Bethlehem in 2015. Beginning of Fauda was quite funny and risky, to the point where we were the only white tablecloth restaurant in Palestine, and people thought I was, taking an enormous risk. I'm pretty stubborn. It worked. It worked because there was a space for it. It worked because we challenged people's perceptions. I realized at that time that there was a very strong desire to discover what Palestinian food was worldwide. And we're seeing all these chefs popping up a bit all over within Palestinian diaspora, starting to cook Palestinian food, starting to write Palestinian cookbooks. And then the London opportunity came up with a Palestinian who's the co-founder of Aqoub, Rasha Khouri. She reached out and said, look, what do you think of this idea? And we embarked on the journey of Aqoub. It's been a year now. It's been a fantastic year. I am extremely proud of the team that's working at 27 Uxbridge. I'm proud at plenty of levels. It's a team of 27 people that come from 17 different nationalities, and they're all cooking and serving Palestinian food with a twist, definitely. It's my vision of what Palestinian food is. We're not a restaurant aimed at a community specifically. We are a restaurant, full stop. We happen to be Palestinian. We happen to be serving Palestinian produce. We happen to be serving Palestinian wines, but we are a restaurant. And opening up this food world, taking it out of a very community-oriented approach, I think is what everybody should be doing with any cuisine. I mean, we've seen recently in London more and more African cuisines being rewarded for what they're doing, fantastic chefs, where 10 years ago, those cuisines were very often limited to their communities.
Well, food is identity everywhere, without a doubt. But in the context of Palestine, how would you explain the link between food and identity for you and for the food that you prepare?
So, yeah, for me, food is identity and food is political. In the context of Palestine, and it's the same, I think, for many other nations, many other groups of people, when your identity is threatened on a daily basis, you attach yourself to everything. And you start with food because food means home. Food is the closest to comfort of saying, but my identity is still there. We have to go back in history. 1948, Israel is created by an international decision on 52% of what was British Mandate Palestine. That leads to 580 villages demolished, 800,000 Palestinian refugees that are thrown out. 1967, there's another 400 to 600,000 refugees thrown out. So imagine that number of people being disconnected with their natural terroir, with their natural land, and they carry those recipes. Of course, it becomes more of a precious element of identity. In today's reality, I'll give you my example. I come from a family that is not refugees. We are from Bethlehem. We've been in Bethlehem for at least, I'd like joking and saying, because we've been a trading family, and I like to say that we've been in Bethlehem since 2,000 years. I come from a Christian family. I think my great-great-grandfather became Christian the day the three Magi showed up in Bethlehem, and he was like, that's a business opportunity, and sold them the gifts they carried to baby Jesus. We lost in 1948. My grandparents used to invest, and they had orange groves in Jaffa, and they had orange groves in Ramla. Those were confiscated by the state of Israel. Of course, the orange has a different symbolic for me. I do feel it is, I won't say a militant act, but I do think it is a very strong identitarian act to cook oranges, to work with oranges, and to say, look, those oranges symbolize for me that plant-programmed theft of my family's land. We used to export oranges. I grew up with the stories of oranges. I was never allowed to see those lands.
Bethlehem is also the title of the book that you have written and that is about to come out.
Mm-hmm.
Why take to writing, and what led you to deciding to write the book, and what went into it from your side?
Wow, that's a difficult question. To start with, our cuisine is a cuisine that's been orally transmitted. I think the real heroes of Palestinian cuisine are mainly women, are every woman that's been cooking Palestinian and transmitting it to the generations to come. But we didn't have many publications of the classic recipes. And we've seen it happen in the last few years where there's plenty of chefs that have written their books. Plenty. Not enough. I think there's space for another 100 Palestinian chefs to write recipes. For me, writing is a very important medium because in that cookbook there's recipes, but there's also a lot of portraits of people, stories of people. And I think we need to celebrate those people. We need to celebrate the artisans, the farmers, in my case, in the book, there's also a lot of my family stories. We need to acknowledge that. We need to give them the space that they've had to influence food. We are at a moment where a lot of our identity is being threatened of disappearing. And any form of documenting it is essential. Sharing it is essential. And also celebrating it. I want to see people cook Palestinian food as innocently as they cook Chinese food, as accessible as they cook Italian food. So it's a bit telling the story without being apologetic about being Palestinian. It is a very Palestinian book. I think a lot of people will be surprised that the book will challenge what they think Palestinian means, because that's the other side of the coin. And then there's the other thing, and I hope the book also does this, which is you do come to Bethlehem and spend 1 or 2 nights in Bethlehem and walk around and meet all the fabulous producers of food, all the fabulous foragers. Walk into I buy my spices from a shop that's been there since 1936. It is a tiny, tiny shop, I would say as big as this studio, and it's a cavern of treasures. That's the Bethlehem I want people to feel. I want people to feel that it's a celebration of Bethlehem and Palestine.
How do you feel Palestinian food can represent a moment of community looking to the future?
For me, community is the universal community. It's beyond a certain ethnicity or a certain group of people. And food is the best way to remind ourselves of our humanity. And I'm not a fan of let's make peace around a hummus plate, because I think it's a load of rubbish. But I do think community is universal. I do think breaking down preconceptions through food will allow all of us in the future to look at how we all fit in one human universal family, rather than what we're seeing today, which is extremely divided. Today, when you're Palestinian, even when you're cooking Palestinian food, we get reactions of people saying, oh, but am I allowed to taste Palestinian food if I am of this or that origin? I'm like, of course. I mean, that's why I open restaurants. It's because you're allowed to cook Palestinian food. You're allowed, and not only allowed, you're encouraged to celebrate those flavors. That community is the community I would love to see.
And now this has been very exciting. I went, of course, to Malmö to cover Eurovision for Monaco. But I had a little stopover in Copenhagen, where I had the pleasure to speak with 2 pop music legends, Jenny Berggren and Ulf Ekberg, from the Swedish group Ace of Base. They were talking to me about their new documentary and their legacy.
It is very personal when you have this personal film material. And of course, all the new material with Jenny and me is very important to add on it, that we can also describe and explain the story in our words with perspective on what happened in the past. It's easier now when you have a few years afterwards, when you have a little more bird perspective on the career, to talk about it, maybe in different words, than when we were actually inside this crazy circus, because it was just very crazy, totally crazy, mayhem all the time.
I mean, it was clear watching the documentary. And I think I mentioned before the interview, it's incredible how personal it was. It talked about difficult moments from the band. But in a way, I think for those who are fans of Ace of Base, it's quite interesting as well, because a lot of documentaries are very sanitized and almost boring. I mean, you don't get to know the artist in a way. But that's very different in this documentary, right, Jenny?
It was one of my main goals to be personal and have a very thin skin towards the people who see it. Why? The reason is that we were talking about the tough moments in our lives, and the legacy of those should be how we fixed it. How we were broken by something, whatever it was, but we also got whole again. And how we managed to have lives today that are normal, working, affectionate. Up is up, down is down. It was not that way when we were in Ace of Base, but now it is. And it takes, you have to take it back. And we did that step by step, and we became whole again step by step. And I even wrote a book about it, how I was going from being half disastered from a fan that broke in. And for me, it was very important to embrace the fans after that, because I knew the fans. They were great personalities, and I'd grown to know them even more. They write their own books about their own experiences since I wrote mine. It's an amazing fan base out there, and it is very important that they were still loved, that they knew that I wouldn't take them away, because that was one night that was really, really horrible for me. So we became whole again in many ways. That was the reason I wanted it to be personal. That is the reason I wanted to be skin thin. So you can feel our pain and you can feel our sorrows, but you can also feel our joy of being the ones who we are today. And that is important. That's a good story to tell. Always a good story to tell.
And what a crazy story as well. There was one moment when you guys cracked down the US, which at the time was very kind of gangster rap or grunge, and suddenly Ace of Base was everywhere. I mean, it must be crazy, because I remember the time in the 90s, you guys were quite unique in the sound, right? Is that the secret of the success, perhaps? And the melodies, of course.
The secret, I think, is because we did music that we wanted to hear ourselves and nobody else did. We were inspired by a few bands like Kraftwerk and Depeche Mode, and at the current band like KLF and Tektronic. But we tried to do what we liked, which ended up to be a massive scale of different genres, which made it quite difficult for record companies to really promote us. What are Ace of Base? What is Ace of Base? Techno, electronic, synth, reggae, pop, what actually are we? It was very difficult in the 90s to do that promotion. So, and that was a great thing to come to Denmark, because nobody got it in Sweden. We tried for years after year after year, and nobody believed in that in Sweden. And suddenly we had this little small record company in Denmark with this crazy record boss, Kjell Vennick, and he was just, I just understand it. I get everything, all of it. I love you guys. So that was amazing. And when we got to US and we reached the charts in the US, and before we even assigned there, so with All That She Wants, we got on the charts just on import. We ended up on the grunge list together with Nirvana, because they didn't know where to place us. On what list do we fit? We were not really pop, we were not really house or techno. So we ended up on the grunge list, which was quite amazing. With us and Nirvana, which was fun.
You were ahead of time.
Yeah, it was very ahead of time.
Music,
yeah, so now it's more natural what pop is. But because we were so early with what we were doing, it was very hard for people to place us. But that was obviously our strength, that suddenly we did something new.
And Jenny, what do you think about the reaction of your own country? Did it change with time, now with the documentary? I mean, how do you feel? Because I know in the beginning it was a bit difficult to crack Sweden. You mentioned Denmark and other countries in Europe. But how do you think Sweden perceives Ace of Base these days?
Well, we experienced a fantastic moment yesterday. We were presenting an award in the Swedish Grammy, and we just went out on stage and the applause were immense. It was fantastic. And then we started to talk and there were interruption with applause. And that was just so great, because that's the grey area of Stockholm, the smog of everybody's being a bit jealous, looking at each other. And we was just soaring above it and wished, I think we said that, like, we wish you who wins now the same success that we had, because we have fans all over the world that has memories to these songs. We were presenting the award of the Song of the Year, and that was a big thing to see that the establishment of the whole Swedish pop scene, who really hated us, or music scene, went just back to us and said, okay, some applause for you guys. That was great.
About time, right?
Yeah, but it's so stupid. I mean, it's so stupid. But I know how the Swedish mind works. I'm a Swede myself. I know exactly. It's like, I'm not supposed to.
And finally, here on The Curator, we were joined by Dara Kleng of Tiela at the Compton Arms in London. She gives us her drinking and dining recommendations for her corner of the city, Roman Road.
Hi, I'm Dara Klein. I am the head chef and owner of Tiella at the Compton Arms, which is a lovely pub in Islington, North London. Today for our tour, we are going to Roman Road in Bow. We are going to venture a little bit further afield from Roman Road, but still in the E3 postcode. I've chosen this location because I have lived in the neighbourhood for the last 4 years. It's my home and I absolutely love it. It's a fabulous part of London. If it's the morning and you're on Roman Road, I would go no further than May and Harvey, which is a beautiful neighbourhood cafe, sort of smack bang in the middle of Roman Road. You can go there for much more than just coffee. You can definitely stay for breakfast or brunch. It's fabulous, really, really good quality coffee. I can't remember off the top of my head what kind of coffee they use, but it's delicious. And their breakfast offering is, really, really wonderful. Quite a diverse but classic menu. Yeah, really a very beloved institution on Roman Road. It's open 7 days a week. On the weekend, you'll see queues way down the street, but obviously my days off are always Monday, Tuesday, so I get to go there and it's lovely and peaceful, but I really recommend it. Depends on the time of day and what I'm ordering. So if it's in the early portion of the morning, I usually just get some fried eggs and bacon and a coffee. They're really famous for their chicken sandwich. It's a roast chicken, chili jam, pickles sandwich on sourdough. It's delicious. They also do a great bacon sarnie. They do great French toast or pancakes. Usually one of those. I'm, not too adventurous in the morning. My favourite place for lunch on Roman Road is a Bengali sweets and curry house called Mithai Gar. It is really wonderful for its samosas and rolls. My favourite thing to order for lunch, however, is their small curry with 2 paratha. It's a really tiny spot. The walls are laden with homemade sweets and really colourful adornments, and don't go past their curry and paratha. It's delicious. But also, if you have space, I'd really recommend to get some samosas or rolls. They're all handmade. The people that work there are lovely. The homemade chai is really heady and it will sort of wake you up out of any slumber. If you have space for a second lunch, about 5 minutes down Roman Road, there is Nur Falafel, which is a real favourite amongst locals. For about £5.50, you get the freshest, most delicious falafel wrap you can find in East London, and they're quite new to the neighbourhood as well, so I had to give them a little shout out as well. So on Roman Road, on I think it's Tuesdays, Thursdays and Saturday, there's the Roman Road Market, which starts at, I think it's the corner of Globe Road and Roman Road, and it sort of stretches all the way down till you're sort of heading really into Bow. And in the market there are some really wonderful food stalls. I say this with my chest, but the best goslam I've ever had in London, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, super, super fresh. The pastry is super thin. The filling is like perfectly seasoned, great cheese, great veg. And directly across from the goslam spot, there is an amazing Indian snack shack, I think it's called. And they do fabulous onion bhaji, really great rolls as well. It's crazy. I think it's a goslam for £2.50. And it's a real neighbourhood institution. You sort of walk down the market and you see a crossover of all the brilliant communities that make Roman Road what it is. Also special mention to Randolfi's Refreshment Bar, which is at the start of the market. And it's this place is a real institution. I'm pretty sure it's been around since the early 1900s. And it is a sandwich bar owned by 2 brothers who are always wearing lab coats. And they really slowly and artfully make the most beautiful sandwiches, quite classic flavours. They call you young lady. It's really sweet. It's a really, fabulous slice of life of Roman Road. favourite place for a drink near Roman Road has to be the Palm Tree, which is a fabulous old pub. Sort of further down towards Bethnal Green. It's cash only. It's very, very old school. On a Sunday they play jazz, which I think is played by the Palm Tree Trio. It's a really beautiful old pub, both in its decor and just the atmosphere. It's a little bit like going back in time. I believe they film a lot of TV shows and films in there because it's gorgeous. And I absolutely adore the bartenders there. They're really sweet, really good Guinness. If you fancy a glass of wine, kind of the only place to get wine on Roman Road to take away, but you can also sit there, is a bottle shop called Vinarius, which is, again, closer towards the market. They have a really nice selection of both natural, organic, a lot of Italian wines. They make a great aperitivo, and you can sit there and also have a little snack. So if you're going for dinner in Bow or Roman Road, I would recommend you venture a little bit further afield from Roman Road to an amazing rustic Italian eatery called Polentina, which is in a really interesting location. It's in if I'm not mistaken, it's an industrial estate, and the restaurant is located within a textile factory. Sophia makes amazing, super traditional, really rustic Italian food that sometimes you only see being made by nonnas in a really remote village. She's really championing really old school Italian food, and it's gorgeous. It's really subtle, really traditional. There's beautiful wine on offer as well, and it's tiny. So it's one of the really special things about Bow for sure.
And that's all we've got time for this week's edition of The Curator. The show was produced by San Impi and presented by me, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Join us again next week. Thank you for listening.